everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on refugee entitlements in Egypt. I'm so pleased to see all of you here attending, especially since it's the afternoon for many of us within Egypt and the African continent. And thank you to all of our participants who are also joining us from Europe and also in the morning in the US and North America. So welcome to everyone. My name is Elena Habersky. I am the project manager of the Refugee Entitlements in Egypt project. This project is a 4-year endeavor that was undertaken by the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, which is a research center at the American University in Cairo. This project is funded by the European Union. I would also like to welcome you on behalf of CMRS and our co-PIs, Dr. Ibrahim Awad, who is our director at CMRS, and Dr. Gerda Heck, a professor both in CMRS and the Sociology and Anthropology departments at the American University in Cairo. I would also like to welcome my colleagues who are with us today and will be helping during the question and answer session, Aya Demir and Amina Ahmed, so welcome to them both. This project would not be where it is today without Aya and Amina's hard work and dedication to this project. Thank you again so much for joining. As this is a webinar, if you have any questions throughout the duration of the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will hopefully get to them during the question and answer session. I look forward to your questions as well. So I'm going to share my screen. Great. So as I mentioned, the Refugee Entitlements in Egypt project is at CMRS and is funded by the European Union. This is a 4-year endeavor. Again, as I have mentioned, we're in literally the last 2 months of the project, so we're almost at the end. So once again, thank you for joining us during our last English online webinar. Just to mention, we will also be having an Arabic webinar this Thursday for those who are interested. The registration link is on our Facebook page if you would like to tell any colleagues or friends. So to kind of walk you through the project, what did we do? How did we get here? The first phase of this project was mainly desk research. So my former colleagues, Claire McNally and Amir Hataba, went through many different laws, international agreements like the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families, etc. Also, regional agreements, for example, the Organization of African Unity or any other documents that came out of the Arab League, bilateral agreements between Egypt and other countries, for example, the Four Freedoms Agreements between Egypt and neighboring Sudan, but also domestic legislation within Egypt. So the first phase took about 21 months. So it was a very long first phase of desk research, but it was extremely important to go through and make sure that we did not miss any law that was on the books or on the record. This type of research had actually never been done before within Egypt, so it was really important that we looked at all levels of law to see, and we'll talk about this when we get into the entitlements, but to see how, for example, the domestic legislation holds up with international agreements that Egypt has signed. So we really wanted to go through and see what has Egypt signed, what have they ratified, and how are these laws put into practice, and how do they interact on the different levels. So like I said, this phase took about 21 months. The second phase was interviews with policymakers and lawyers. So, okay, we have the law, we know what the law says, we know what it is. What do the policymakers and lawyers who are on the ground interacting with the law on a daily basis say and see, for example, in their work, especially those that work directly with refugees and migrants in Egypt and Cairo in particular, but maybe perhaps also outside of Cairo. So we interviewed, for example, lawyers from United Lawyers Association and the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights, but also policymakers within government institutions and different ministries throughout Cairo. So the Ministry of Education, for example, the Ministry of Health and Population, and other government institutions. The third phase then, which I view as the most important, was we held focus group discussions with 9 different migrant communities throughout Cairo. So, okay, we have the law, we talk to lawyers, we talk to policymakers, but what are the migrant communities themselves experiencing on the ground when it comes to trying to get these entitlements? For example, enrolling their children in school, accessing healthcare, trying to rent an apartment. We wanted to know what their day-to-day lived experiences were. This is the most important, obviously, and it's our most direct source of information. As I have mentioned, this type of research had never been done before, so it's very important for us that we make sure that we talk to the different communities. So we talked to the major, I would say, the most populous migrant communities within Cairo, which include, for example, Syrians, Sudanese, South Sudanese, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Iraqi, Yemeni, Palestinians from Syria. We really wanted to speak with them and, again, to have their shared experiences with them in community with themselves so they feel comfortable, but also that they feel that they can speak freely about their experiences. We also conducted interviews with NGOs and INGOs that are working on the ground. Many of them work directly with refugee and asylum-seeking communities. Some are branching out into this field and trying to incorporate refugees and asylum seekers within their work. So we tried to gain a plethora of different organizations on the ground. For example, NGOs like Tadamman, Refuge Egypt, St. Andrews, but also international organizations like Plan, Save the Children, Caritas, and also, of course, UN organizations, UNHCR, IOM, UNICEF, those that work directly with the populations that we are targeting. Of course, we did, like any research project, face limitations within our research. For example, accessing Egyptian legislation was sometimes very difficult. Either sometimes we read about a law and we couldn't find it, or the law itself, the one copy, for example, that we found was faded, and we had difficulty reading the actual law, but also sometimes translating the law from Arabic into English. So at the end of the presentation, I will be sharing some documents from our website. The report itself, which I will get into, is 322 pages, which is a lot and it's overwhelming, which is why we're having a webinar. But we also have a summary of the reports in Arabic for those Arabic-speaking populations. And we also have an annex to the report where we have every single law that is in the entire report listed and in English if necessary. So for example, I'll be talking about a decree in the education part that speaks to nationalities that can access public schools. The decree is written in Arabic, but we translated it into English. So if people are doing research, they can more easily access it and then find it also in Arabic as well. Also, another limitation was obviously nationalities of concern, who we were going to try and talk to. Unfortunately, for example, we tried to talk to the Libyan population in Alexandria, but during the time that we were doing the research, we were just unable to go up to Alexandria to conduct the interviews. But we are very well aware that they are a very important population within Egypt and within this research. But unfortunately, this was a limitation that we as a project faced within the research phase. Okay. So what about the report? How is it set up? As I mentioned, the report itself is 322 pages. It's a lot. But we wanted to be as in-depth as possible. And also we realized that many people who are interested in certain entitlements may only go to one entitlement, for example, like healthcare, housing, access to courts, detention and expulsion. We're not expecting everyone to read the whole 322-page report. If you do, awesome, congratulations. I think you'll probably only be joining the team who has read the entire report. But we wanted to set it up in a structure that is very easy to go through and to find what you're looking for. So for example, before we start with the entitlements, which I will mention, we give kind of a background on who are we looking at. So within this project, we're looking at three main groups. Asylum seekers, those who are seeking asylum through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Egypt, the government of Egypt, has a memorandum of understanding with UNHCR that at this point in time, UNHCR will take care of the refugee status determination within the country. So we're looking at asylum seekers. We're looking at refugees. So those who, once they go through the asylum process and are found that they do indeed apply or can receive refugee status, that then they receive a host of entitlements. So obviously the bulk of our research is looking at refugees, the topic of our entire project, refugee entitlements in Egypt. But we are also looking at failed asylum seekers. So those who apply for refugee status, they are asylum seekers, but then once they go through refugee status determination, they are found that they do not meet the criteria to become a refugee. Why are we looking at this particular group? Based on our own observations and research, we know that many failed asylum seekers do not indeed go back home for a various number of reasons. Some of them might not feel safe. Some of them just might not have the resources to go back home, and they end up staying in Egypt irregularly. So we do know that this population exists, and we want to know what rights and entitlements they are owed, if any, because they are in Egypt irregularly. So the legal framework obviously goes over this basic methodology of the groups we are looking at. And each chapter of the report covers one different entitlement. So we start off with a legal framework in each chapter, going from international to regional to domestic, to bilateral and then to domestic. So obviously, for example, international law, we're looking mainly at the Refugee Convention, but also the other conventions that I've mentioned previously that Egypt has signed and ratified. Then we're looking at regional law, the Organization of African Unity, 1969 convention is the main one, but also the Arab Rights of the Child or any other regional law that may be applicable. Then we're looking at bilateral agreements that Egypt has signed. I mentioned the Four Freedoms Agreement, but they also have various bilateral agreements with other countries like Yemen, Jordan, Mexico even, and other bilateral agreements that could possibly affect refugees and asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers. And then, of course, the domestic law. So the law that usually I would say, and we're going to get into this, the government follows the most because it's the one that affects everyone's day-to-day life. Then after we go through all of the legal framework, the meat of the chapter, we go into the implementation. How is this law implemented in real life? And this is where the interviews come in that I spoke about. The interviews with policymakers, with lawyers, with practitioners in the field, with researchers, but most importantly, the migrant communities themselves. How are these laws actually implemented? And then finally, our recommendations. So based off of the desk research, based off of the legal research, and based off of the implementation that we found from our interviews, do we see any gaps? Do we see any room for improvement? And if we do, what are they? This is how we end each chapter. We give recommendations based off of our findings in the project. Now I'm going to get into the main part of the webinar. So there are 8 different legal entitlements, as I have mentioned. I'm going to go through all of them, obviously not very, very in-depth. Like I said, 322 pages, but the project team tried to find the most important details to speak with you about. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But also we'll be sharing the link to the full report if you would like to go more in depth. You're more than welcome to do so, especially if one entitlement interests you perhaps more than others. So when we're talking about family unity and reunification, based off of the international law, everyone, regardless of their legal status, has the right to family unity and to family reunification. So this means that as a family, you have the right to not be separated. But unfortunately, we know for many asylum seekers and refugees, and even failed asylum seekers, they are separated perhaps on the journey or when they get to their country of asylum. So if this does happen, if this separation does happen, they have a right for family reunification. So to be reunited with their family members. They also have the right to receive assistance to be reunified with their family. What is this relevant for? For example, derivative refugee status. What does this mean? So if, for example, a father applies for refugee status, maybe he's a single father, for example, and he gets refugee status, then that means that usually his children, who are probably young, will also receive refugee status based off of him getting refugee status. This is what we mean by derivative. Usually one family member receives it, and based off of this, because they're a family unit, they're probably coming from the same situation, the same city, the same town, the same village, unfortunately probably the same persecution. Because of this, they shall all receive refugee status based off of one particular family member. Expulsion, severing family unity. So expulsion should only be used as a last resort, and we'll get into this more in depth, but refugees have protection from being refoulement or sent back to their country of origin based on the 1951 convention, but also failed asylum seekers also have a right to not be expelled from their country of origin, to their country of origin if they face persecution or torture. However, if this expulsion happens, the person expelled should have the right to be reunited once again with their family, especially if they do have refugee status. We have seen, unfortunately, that sometimes refugees are expelled from their country of asylum, which is usually against the law. And if this happens, then they have a right to be reunited with their family. We also have requests for family reunification. So maybe they're separated on the journey, and once one family member gets to their country of asylum, they will request that their other family members, perhaps in the country of origin or on the route of asylum, be reunited with them in the country of asylum. However, in practice, in Egypt, this is very difficult to access because there are no clear procedures in Egyptian domestic law, which tells a refugee or an asylum seeker or failed asylum seeker what to do in the case of family unity and reunification. We've also found within our research that sometimes it just depends on the government official. So while many people said they were unable to reunite with their families, we did find a few people who were able to, but honestly, all of their stories were different in the procedures needed in order to reunify with their families. In addition, there's no clear definition of what family means. So many times when we're talking about family unity and reunification, we're talking about close family members. But what defines a close family member? It can be different based on the culture, based on the country of origin, based on a whole host of different issues. So oftentimes people struggle and be reunited with a cousin or an aunt or a more distant family member, which in their mind isn't, of course, a close family member, but perhaps in the state of asylum, it is not. So these are the issues we mainly see with family reunification and unity within Egypt. So obviously our recommendation for this entitlement as a project was to have clear procedures and steps to apply for family reunification within Egypt, but also to define family as broadly as possible so people aren't left out of family reunification, especially based on different various aspects like culture or place of origin or other issues that might, define family different from someone else. So to try and have a definition that is as broad and encompassing as possible, so this entitlement can come to fruition in Egypt. So our second entitlement is employment. Employment is a very complex entitlement, as I'm sure many of you can imagine, even if you work in the field or not, but it's complex anywhere. So for refugees, and asylum seekers, it's even more so complex. So there's two main parts, right, to employment. There's wage earning employment, which is the traditional form of work. You go to work, you work for a boss or a company, and at the end of the month, you receive a salary. There's also self-employment, which means that you try and start your own business. Perhaps you hire other people to assist you, but you're mainly your own boss. Everyone under international law has the right to just and favorable conditions of work, generally speaking. They also have the right to access work without discrimination, with special provisions for foreigners that are possible. However, it is possible for states, meaning Egypt in this case, to impose different rules for foreigners when it comes to employment. For example, if you are an alien resident in Egypt, you need to apply for a work permit if you want to work as a wage earning employee. You also might need to fulfill certain conditions, like have certain certifications or certain educational backgrounds in order to be employed within the company that you're hoping to work for. These provisions and differentiations between nationals and foreigners, like I said, are fine under law, but they should be reasonable and objective. You shouldn't have provisions that are completely out there and unreasonable for any foreigner to meet the fulfillments and requirements. As I mentioned, all foreigners in Egypt need a work permit, and usually speaking, generally speaking, for the majority of foreigners, these work permits have to be renewed every year. Refugees should have special provisions entitled to them. What are these special provisions? To enjoy the most favorable treatment accorded to nationals when it comes to employment. So what we found in the law, refugees should receive special provisions for employment if they have resided in Egypt for 3 years, or they're married or have a child who has Egyptian nationality. So if they've lived in Egypt for 3 years, they should receive these special provisions, or if their spouse is Egyptian or their children hold Egyptian nationality, they should also be privy to these special provisions granted to them. However, in law, we have found that this does not really happen at all, unfortunately. We also know that the main way of gaining employment, the work permit, is often very costly. It can go up to 12,000 Egyptian pounds per year. That's the ceiling right now. Starts off at 5, and then it goes up 1,000 pounds every year until it hits 12,000. It's also a complicated and oftentimes tiresome process, especially the fact that many people need to do it on a yearly basis. So what does this mean for refugees and asylum seekers, and especially failed asylum seekers who are here irregularly? They rely on the informal labor market, right? Which we know the majority of Egyptians also take part in. The informal labor market in Egypt is bigger than the formal labor market. However, some of the issues that we see with the informal labor market is it opens up people to vulnerability and exploitation and oftentimes abuse. Unfortunately, for domestic workers, especially single women, we found that they face these issues on a daily basis within the informal labor market. There's also no contract usually within the informal labor market, and they also might not receive the wages they're promised, and then they have there's no repercussions for this because it's informal. They really have nowhere to go to voice or file their complaints. Self-employment, we also found, is very costly. And a lot of the refugees and asylum seekers we spoke to who are self-employed are often doing so not within the law of self-employment, but they just opened up their businesses on their own, but they have no deed or legal paperwork to back up their business. So obviously, our recommendations are to make the entire process easier. So people are not as dependent on, for example, if they're not employed and they don't have money, this, and we'll see in other entitlements, causes issues in other entitlements like housing and accessing education and healthcare, especially if they're not receiving a salary. So we want the process to become easier, especially for refugees, but we also want the provisions that are supposed to be granted to refugees to be implemented and followed. For example, if they've lived in Egypt for more than 3 years, or if they are married to an Egyptian or have children who hold Egyptian nationality, we want them to be able to access these special provisions which are in Egyptian law. Okay, education. So everyone, regardless of your nationality or your legal status, so this includes failed asylum seekers, has a right to free and compulsory primary education regardless of nationality. So this is primary, mainly here we're talking about elementary education, and then secondary and tertiary education, which usually means middle school, high school, and university, should be generally available and accessible. However, secondary and tertiary education does not need to be free. It can be at a higher fee than nationals, Egyptian nationals pay. However, Egypt does have a reservation to the 1951 convention when it comes to education. So this means that Egypt has signed and said that they will realize this entitlement over time, so progressively. So what they were thinking when they signed the convention is we might not have the resources available to provide, for example, free and compulsory primary education, but hopefully over time, we will be able to do so. But right now, we're not able, so we're going to realize this progressively. However, the issue with reservations and the convention is there's no end date for a country if they put a reservation to then follow through and follow up with it. So it's been many decades that Egypt has supposedly been trying to realize this, but we're still not there yet. So this is what I'm going to talk about in what we see in practice. So in the Egyptian law, we see certain bilateral agreements between the government of Egypt and other countries in the region where children are able to access primary education like a national. For example, Egypt has bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia, with Libya, with Jordan, and other countries where those children of these nationalities can access the public school system. There are also agreements, for example, where Sudanese, and by definition now South Sudan, because when the agreement was written, they were part of Sudan, could also access the public school system, but they have to pay a slightly higher fee than nationals. In 2018, there was also a decree written, which has since been followed up every year, that Syrian and Yemeni children can access public education at no cost, like a national also can. So while we do see in the Egyptian law that certain nationalities can access the public school system, we're also seeing that many nationalities obviously cannot access the public school system, which is discrimination based off of their nationality. Now, for the majority of the nationalities we see, they are non-Arabic speaking populations. And when we talk to, for example, government officials or representatives from the United Nations, this is the point that they keep bringing up. If we were to put them in the public school system, they might not be able to understand the language of instruction because it is in Arabic and perhaps these children do not speak Arabic. However, many of the children have been born in Egypt. They've grown up in Egypt, and many of them do actually speak and understand the Arabic language. So we find it problematic that, for example, nationalities from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia cannot access the public school system like the other nationalities. So one of our main recommendations, obviously, for this is that Egypt follow all of the international conventions that state that primary education, A, be compulsory, but also B, to be free. Some other issues that we do see within education, obviously, and this doesn't necessarily just affect the refugee and asylum-seeking communities, but also Egyptians as well, unfortunately. We do see overcrowding in the public school system, a lack of resources. For example, we've heard that, sometimes students go in and there aren't enough desks within the classrooms. Discrimination, unfortunately, based off of nationality or race. Bullying is a huge issue that we see predominantly towards African refugee populations, but we obviously know that bullying is an issue worldwide, not necessarily based off of race or nationality, but we do see this predominantly, for example, with South Sudanese and Sudanese students. Also, a lot of teachers are not paid a living wage, so in order to try and make more money, they hold almost mandatory tutoring sessions after classes have ended, which students need to go in order to learn what was taught during the day. And obviously for many refugees and failed asylum seekers, they don't have the money needed to pay these extra tutoring sessions. So we've actually seen a response from the refugee communities to try and overcome these issues, especially with education, because people know how important education is. So what we've seen, obviously this is nothing new, but the refugee communities themselves have started community-based organization schools. So these schools are started or founded by the communities themselves. They have refugee teachers from the communities, they have staff also from the communities, and they usually teach the curriculum of their country of origin. So for example, there's South Sudanese community schools in Ain Shams, or there's Ethiopian, or there's Somali, or there's Syrian. So even for nationalities that are able to access the public school system, we found through our interviews that many families, for example, they may apply or register their children to attend the public school, but they only go to take exams. They don't actually attend classes. The classes they attend are from the community schools, but they do go to the public schools so they can take the exams and get the certificates needed. Some reasons, as I've said, overcrowding, discrimination, etc. So the families would rather they do this, where they get the certificate from the public school, but they receive an education from the community school. However, the community-based schools are not recognized in Egypt under Egyptian law or by the Ministry of Education. We've been told, because these community schools are not necessarily in school buildings, but oftentimes apartment buildings that are rented, perhaps they don't have a fire escape, or they don't have the necessary safety standards that a school would be beholden to. So because of this, they view it as an issue. Or if there's an issue with a teacher, perhaps, God forbid, there's some kind of abuse, there's no complaint mechanism that a school might have that a community school won't have. So because of some of these issues, they have not been recognized by the government and the Ministry of Education. When it comes to secondary and tertiary education, obviously the main problem we see is the cost. It's inaccessible for many people. Also, a lot of, for example, perhaps teenagers or college students, if they do unfortunately have to flee their country of origin, they don't bring previous school certificates with them. So it's oftentimes more difficult to enter secondary or tertiary education without these certificates. Or if they do have certificates, they might not be recognized by the school or by the government because they're from a different country. Also, sometimes, depending on the language of instruction, the student might not have either the Arabic or the English levels needed to enter secondary or tertiary education. So obviously, our recommendations in this chapter are for all nationalities to be able to access the public school system, especially for primary education, which should be free and compulsory. For secondary and tertiary education, to make it generally available and accessible, which is required by international law. We have seen, for example, the American University in Cairo, but also other universities offering scholarships, particularly for refugee communities, but to also have other options available for people, and to recognize community schools. We believe that even though the community schools have their issues, they are taking a huge burden off of the public school system within Egypt. So we hope within the future that they will be recognized by the government of Egypt and the Ministry of Education. Okay, health. Obviously another very, very important entitlement. especially now if we're thinking about COVID and other issues with regard to health. So when we're talking about health, we're talking with regard to the law, to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So it's not just like a disease, for example, in your body, but also we're talking about mental health as well, which we can imagine for vulnerable populations is incredibly important. Also, to access medical services without discrimination based off of your nationality, your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, or any other attributes that you might be discriminated against for. You should be able to access medical services without any form of discrimination. Within Egypt, the law is actually very, very good when it comes to refugees. So in 2016, the Ministry of Health and Population signed a memorandum of understanding with UNHCR. What the memorandum of understanding says is that refugees have equal access, like Egyptian nationals, to primary, secondary, and emergency health care. So just like in Egyptians, they have a right to access public, primary, secondary, and emergency health care on par with nationals. So on paper, on law, this is a really great entitlement. And in other countries, we unfortunately don't see this. So this is really great for Egypt to have this law on the books. Unfortunately, it does not include asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers. However, the Egyptian constitution does state that it is a crime to withhold emergency medical care from anyone based off of anything you can imagine, including your legal status. So if you do have an emergency and you go to a public hospital, they cannot turn you away. It will be a crime based off of the Egyptian constitution. Also, when it comes to healthcare, we're talking about health insurance. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, and if we're thinking about employment, the entitlement that I spoke about before, most health insurance is tied to a job, so holding some kind of employment, which we can imagine for many of these vulnerable populations is not possible because they can't hold wage earning employment or a work permit in Egypt. So this makes having health insurance incredibly difficult. There are certain ways you can have health insurance. If, for example, you do get a work permit and your job provides it, that's great. Also, you may be able to get it through your children attending Egyptian public school. You may have like a derivative status to obtain health insurance. We do know that Egypt has started a health insurance scheme in 2018, which we were told would include not only migrants, but specifically refugees and asylum seekers within the entire health insurance scheme, which again is great news when it comes to health. However, it will take about 14 years for this health insurance scheme to be completely realized. So not until about 2034, 2032, I believe. And the bigger cities like Cairo, Alexandria, or the cities that mainly host the most urban refugees will be amongst the last places where this health insurance scheme will be implemented. So we're going to have to wait, obviously, a few years for this to be realized, but we hope once the health insurance scheme is realized that it will include migrants and other vulnerable populations. When it comes to health, like I said, the law, great. It's an excellent law. What are the difficulties so we found in the implementation? I would just like to reiterate that many of these issues not only affect migrants, asylum seekers, failed asylum seekers, and refugees, but also unfortunately Egyptians as well when it comes to the public health sector in specific. We see obviously a lack of resources. For example, a lack of beds. We have heard from different migrant communities that they unfortunately face discrimination when they go into the public hospitals, especially Ethiopians, because of the political issue between Egypt and Ethiopia with regard to the Nile Dam project in Ethiopia. Many spoke about a low quality of services or not having enough trained doctors available or on hand to treat whatever ailments that they have come in with. Also, perhaps a lack of hygiene within the public hospitals. Private hospitals are obviously an option, but private hospitals are expensive, and for many refugees and asylum seekers, obviously not accessible because of the cost. This makes them rely a lot on service providers, but even then, we can't always rely on the service providers because only they have so many resources as well. So we want the public health sector, our recommendation obviously, is for there be greater investment within the public health sector to improve the quality, to have more trained doctors. We know that this is obviously a huge ask and a big challenge, but this is mainly, the main issue that we're seeing because the law is so good. We are very thankful that Egypt has included migrants within the COVID-19 vaccine campaign. Refugees are able to sign up through the online portal system, and their UNHCR cards should be able to be used as a valid form of identification. Also, for example, children within Egypt can receive the vaccinations that are needed within childhood, as long as they show that they are residents. So again, we want to make this accessible to all children, regardless of their legal status. But when it comes to healthcare, the law, like I mentioned, is great. We just see issues, for example, in the implementation. So obviously, like I said, our recommendation is to invest more within the health system within Egypt, because without a healthy society, we see many different problems. So we need a whole of society approach, especially when it comes to healthcare. Okay, housing. So housing, if we're looking at the law, is an adequate standard of living, usually including adequate housing. However, Egypt again has a reservation on this, where they say they will realize this progressively. However, even though they have a reservation, basic shelter should be a minimum standard for Egypt to provide for refugees and asylum seekers. However, it's not, adequate shelter isn't necessarily a right to housing per se, but just a place where you can be sheltered in safety and security. Unfortunately, we know that many refugees are unable, refugees, asylum seekers as well, failed asylum seekers especially, are unable to pay the high cost of rent in many neighborhoods, not only within Cairo, but throughout Egypt. So this means that many vulnerable communities live in informal housing situations and in perhaps lower income neighborhoods within Greater Cairo. Because they're living in these informal settlements, there are obviously a whole host of other issues that come from this. For example, issues with the landlords. The landlords don't want to sign a contract. They don't want to register the apartments. So this then makes it more difficult. If the rentee has an issue, they have no legal pathway to file a complaint because there's no contract and the apartment has not been registered. Obviously, another huge issue, paying rent on time. Again, tied to employment. If there's no wage earning employment that's stable, many refugees are unable to pay perhaps the full amount at the end of the month, or sometimes they go months without being able to pay rent. Oftentimes, many refugees, asylum seekers, failed asylum seekers will live multiple people in one apartment so they can try and split the cost to be able to afford rent. But this again brings safety issues, security issues, and other issues from overcrowding, and especially in informal house or apartment building. We also obviously see discrimination, not only from the landlords, but within the communities themselves, especially towards single women or single mothers with children. We were told about security issues, especially once again with single women, that people try to break into their apartments, that people follow them home at night, that they don't feel safe necessarily going out by themselves, but they have no other option and really no other place to live because this is the most affordable option for them. Within Egypt, Egypt doesn't have refugee camps, unlike many perhaps of its neighbors in Jordan, in Lebanon, and other countries. So refugees and asylum seekers, obviously not failed asylum seekers because they're here irregularly, but regular migrants are able to move freely and choose their own place of residence within Egypt that are subject to other foreigners. So what does this mean? Many foreigners, right, can move freely within Egypt, but they can't go to North Sinai, or perhaps the border regions are off limits. This isn't necessarily discrimination because it affects all foreigners, but generally speaking, right, people can move freely. They can choose their place of residence as other foreigners can. So when it comes to housing, we want our recommendations are obviously to train, for example, the police or other judicial appointees, because a huge problem we heard was issues between landlords and rentees. But because the rentees feel like the police or whoever they go to might automatically just side with the Egyptian in their conflict or whatever their issue is, they don't even bother going to try and, you know, file a complaint or file a lawsuit or anything because they feel it's not worth it. So one thing, especially when it comes to housing, is to try and train these government officials with the rights that are accorded to refugees and asylum seekers within Egypt. Also, to make sure that these government officials know that the UNHCR card is a valid form of identification. People should be able to rent using their UNHCR cards. We know many people either lost their residency cards from their country of origin, or their passports have expired and they obviously don't feel safe approaching their embassy or their consulate to renew it. So the UNHCR card should be a valid form of identification in order to rent an apartment or a house. And also, housing is very much tied with employment. Unfortunately, it is the right of a landlord to forcibly evict someone under the law if they fail to pay rent for multiple months in a row, which you can imagine is obviously an issue that many refugees and asylum seekers face. And we feel that this is directly tied to a lack of employment. So to try and make, once again, the employment system easier and to follow the provisions entitled for refugees so they can receive a monthly salary, which will assist them then in paying their rent and keeping them and their families and their loved ones safe and secure in a stable environment. Okay, detention and expulsion. So as I had mentioned before, there are special entitlements, obviously, for refugees and asylum seekers that they should not be detained without like due process. Obviously, sometimes people break the law, people commit a crime. This isn't what we're talking about. We're mainly talking about arbitrary detention, which we find happens, I don't want to say frequently, but it does happen amongst the refugee and asylum seeking communities, especially for those of African origin. We find that this mainly stems from either a lack of residency or perhaps their residency is in the renewal process and maybe they don't have it on them. Especially we're saying this during COVID-19 when many government institutions were closed and then there was a backlog. Or they show their UNHCR card as a valid form of identification and it's either not recognized or the people stopping them just don't know that this is a valid form of identification. So these are the main reasons why we see arbitrary detention. And we also found this when we were talking in our focus group discussion. However, expulsion, right? So if you are applying for asylum or you have received refugee status, you are not supposed to be sent back to your country of origin where you risk persecution because your country of origin cannot or is unwilling or unable to protect you. So expulsion should not happen. It should be like an absolute last resort. There are a few reasons why a refugee might be expelled back to their country of origin by law. For example, if they're found guilty of terrorism charges, but this is incredibly rare, as we can imagine. So for the main part, Refugees and asylum seekers should not be arbitrarily detained, and they should not be expelled back from their country of origin. When it comes to failed asylum seekers, they're not in the country regularly, right? So they don't maybe have as much rights about being expelled back to their country of origin. However, Egypt has signed other international instruments which do protect failed asylum seekers from being sent back to their country of origin. For example, if it is known that they get sent back, that they will face violence or they will face torture, the country should not send them back. So if Egypt has people, for example, in detention, they're irregular, but they're aware that if they send them back to their country of origin, they will face violence and persecution or torture. Egypt should not send them back based off of international law and other conventions which they have signed and ratified. There are also special entitlements for certain nationalities, for example, Sudanese, based off of Four Freedoms Agreements. It's difficult for us to know if this is being implemented, but Sudanese do have special entitlements when it comes to especially expulsion because of the agreements to live visa-free, for example, within Egypt or Sudan. We know this has changed in the past few years, especially for single men, aged 18 to 50, I believe. But throughout different bilateral agreements, certain nationalities do have special entitlements. When it comes to arbitrary detention, the main organization that helps refugees and asylum seekers with this situation is obviously UNHCR. When we talk to the communities and either they themselves or their friends or family members were detained, there is a hotline via UNHCR in which they can try and access, and UNHCR can then try and work with the government to get especially refugees and asylum seekers out of detention. Of course, we've heard stories, sometimes the hotline doesn't work or it takes maybe longer and the person who called is not told what the procedures are or what's happening over time. So of course there are issues, but mainly, frankly speaking, like UNHCR usually does try and assist to the best of their ability in getting those who are arbitrarily detained out of detention. There should also be a basic standard of treatment for detainees under Egyptian law, whether they be foreign or Egyptian. They should have access to educational services, healthcare, basic nutrition, clothes, etc. under the law. So obviously these should be followed. But our basic recommendations on this entitlement is obviously for the police or any type of security personnel to realize the validity of UNHCR cards as a form of identification, because we hear that sometimes people are just detained because they only have their UNHCR card and no other form of identification. So to realize that this is a valid form of ID. To improve the conditions, if possible, regardless of nationality, within detention, to have an availability of interpreters, because a lot of times we hear that sometimes a refugee or asylum seeker is detained, but they don't speak Arabic, and then the security personnel doesn't speak their native language. So to have interpreters available to know what's happening and what the process is. To streamline communication in general, people should know why they're detained and what's happening to them. So to try and streamline this communication process. And for those detained to have access to a lawyer and an appeals process if necessary, especially if they are being charged with a crime. If you are found guilty, there should be an appeals process available. You should not just be expelled right away if this were to happen. So these are recommendations on detention and expulsion. Okay, there's only 2 more entitlements left, I promise, so thank you for sticking with us. So the second to last entitlement is access to courts. So the right to access courts should be under the same conditions as nationals for foreigners, whether it be criminal law or civil law. Whether you want to file a complaint or a complaint has been filed against you, you should have the right to access Egyptian courts as the same conditions as Egyptian nationals. There are several rights to ensure fair proceedings when it comes to accessing courts for refugees and asylum seekers. For example, as I mentioned with detention, you should have access to an appeals process. You should be compensated if you have been unfairly charged with a crime, for example. There should always be an assumption of innocence if you have been charged. So this is innocent until proven guilty. You should always be able to contact a lawyer and to have representation, especially someone who can either speak your language or to also have an interpreter available so you can communicate with your legal representation. And you should always have enough time to prepare a defense if you have been charged with a crime. So you can't be charged with something and then the next day you have to go to court. You should have enough time, you and your legal representation, to prepare a defense. You also technically have a right to contact your embassy if you've been detained. However, we know when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, many of them will not want to contact their embassy because this is the government that they've been, fleeing, that they're saying is unwilling or unable to protect them. So while the right does exist, it's not actualized for many refugees and asylum seekers, especially failed asylum seekers who are here regularly because they don't feel safe in contacting their embassy. So what are the issues or the difficulties we found in the implementation? Obviously, the majority of refugees and asylum seekers, and especially failed asylum seekers who are here irregularly, prefer not to press charges, either because the process is cumbersome, it's long, it doesn't make sense. They feel that as a foreigner, they won't be treated as fairly as an Egyptian. So they don't even bother actually either going to the police or going to a lawyer or trying to even access the court. So right away, even though this right exists, many refugees and asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers don't even bother. Some of them who have, unfortunately, have negative experiences. And then these negative experiences obviously travel, the news travels amongst communities. So this again, then they're hesitant to try and access the court because someone else has had a negative experience in trying to access this entitlement. There's discrimination, as I have mentioned. If they have tried to access, they feel that they weren't given due process. They feel like if they got into a conflict with an Egyptian, the Egyptian was automatically taken at face value, and they were not because they're not from this country. So obviously we've seen discrimination. And obviously for failed asylum seekers, they can technically access the court, but they have a fear of deportation if they do because they're not here regularly. So for many failed asylum seekers, they will not even attempt to access any form of legal proceedings for fear of being found that they're here irregularly, and then they will be deported. And then our last, but not least, entitlement is documentation. So documentation is obviously, it encompasses a lot, and it's a very long entitlement. So I suggest if you want more information on documentation, please check out our reports because we go more in depth. But there are many different aspects when it comes to documentation. For example, having identity papers. Having identity papers is essential to accessing most services, to registering a marriage, to registering a birth, to registering a death, to applying to school. A whole host of things stem from the fact that you have identity papers. So for asylum seekers, right, this means having a UNHCR yellow card. If you have the blue card, this means you are a refugee. So having, some form of identity, but also having this UNHCR card recognized as a valid form of identification is crucial. This is an issue, obviously, we have found not only in documentation itself, but in the other entitlements. Many government officials either don't know, they're unaware, or they just don't recognize the UNHCR card as a valid form of identification. There's also travel documents. which refugees should technically be able to access and receive, especially for those who have expired or lost passports. However, and this right stems from the Refugee Convention. However, there are no travel documents issued in Egypt, unfortunately. Egypt does not recognize this entitlement. So obviously one of our recommendations is for Egypt to issue, travel documents for refugees. This entitlement does not include asylum seekers, and obviously failed asylum seekers who are here irregularly, but refugees should be able to receive some form of travel documents. Egypt can say, for example, as a state, that you can only travel to certain countries, and you're also beholden to the same visa regulations as Egyptians would be, but you should still be able to travel in and outside of Egypt if necessary. When it comes to residency permits, there are new procedures as of this past summer for obtaining a residency permit. It used to be a bit more complex, but from what we've heard in our trainings and from talking to the migrant communities themselves, this has become a bit easier. So we're hoping over time it will even become a quicker process. However, Egyptian law states that refugees should receive residency permits every 3 years. So you should receive a residency permit and it should be valid for 3 years. However, in practice, unfortunately, refugees and asylum seekers only receive residency permits for 6 months. You can imagine the administrative effort it takes to renew your residency every 6 months, both on behalf of the government, but also on your own stress levels. It takes, about a month. We've heard now with the new procedures to go through the entire process. And then at that point, it's already 5 months. And then before the 5 months are up, you need to start the process over. And this happens and it keeps occurring and occurring and occurring. So you stay valid, legally regular within Egypt. So one thing that we have found is many refugees just decide to go irregular, to not renew their residency, because it takes so much effort to do this every few months. And it's also, I believe, £100 every time you have to renew for the new residency card that's available. So the cost is also sometimes prohibitive for people and families, especially. So obviously our recommendation for this is to follow the law and to have 3-year residency permits instead of 6 months. Birth certificates, again, super crucial and important, especially with regard to statelessness. If you don't have a nationality or an identity, this is a huge problem and will follow you, unfortunately, for the rest of your life. So to try and not become stateless, obviously registering the birth and having a birth certificate is crucial. Now, for most people, for most communities we talk to, the administrative steps are pretty straightforward. 15 days after the birth occurs, you have to have registered the birth. So within 15 days, you should receive a birth certificate. And for many people, it's easy. It's pretty straightforward, no problem. When do we see problems with birth certificates? For example, the child is born on the journey from their country of origin to Egypt, and there's no birth notification because either the birth happened literally on a path to Egypt, or it happened outside of a clinic or a hospital, so there was no birth notification. And if there's no birth notification, then you can't apply for a birth certificate. So obviously one of our recommendations, especially for asylum seekers and refugees, is to waive the need for both a birth notification in order to register the birth of the child. Also, if the father is either doesn't recognize the child or the parents aren't married. Now, technically, you do not need a marriage certificate to register a birth within Egypt by law. However, we found that most government officials require there to be a marriage certificate in order to register the birth, which is obviously prohibitive for single mothers, for those whose perhaps the father doesn't recognize the child, but also especially for victims of rape. So if they don't know who the father is, they oftentimes have difficulty in registering the birth of their child. Also, their UNHCR card should be a valid form of identification. And as mentioned in pretty much all of the other legal entitlements, sometimes the government officials do not recognize the UNHCR card as a valid form of identification. So obviously, a recommendation for this is to not need the birth notification, to allow single parents and individuals to register the birth of a child, and to recognize the UNHCR card as a valid form of identification. Okay, so those, in a nutshell, were the 8 legal entitlements that our project went over. So what did we conclude overall? As I have mentioned, and as you can probably see or have heard, there are gaps between implementation and what the legal research says. Why are there gaps? Sometimes there's literally just no domestic legislation in place for the entitlement. So there might be an international law that Egypt has signed, but there's no domestic law, and then the international law is just not followed. Or sometimes the domestic law directly conflicts with the international law. So the domestic law in this case is usually followed. However, it conflicts with the international law that Egypt has signed. So we see a gap, for example, in education. This happens. Or there's a lack of awareness that the domestic legislation exists, so they don't follow it. Or, for example, there's a lack of resources like healthcare. So the domestic legislation exists, but there's a lack of resources when it comes to, for example, improving the quality of the healthcare system within Egypt. So what are the ways forward as we're ending nearing the end of this project? Obviously, we're doing awareness raising and capacity building. We've done trainings with stakeholders, so practitioners who are working directly in the field with refugees and asylum seekers. But we also held 20 trainings with the communities themselves. We trained individuals so they can also do the trainings in languages that perhaps obviously we don't know. So we had a Somali training, for example, where we trained people from Somalia and then they were able to give the training in Somali. We're also working on visibility materials, which we will obviously share on all our social media sites. So we will have videos on each of these entitlements. The videos will be in Arabic, but they will have English subtitles. We're also creating brochures on the legal entitlements in Arabic, English, Oromo, Tigrinya, and Somali. So hopefully we can reach more people who perhaps don't speak or read English or Arabic. And also we're looking at ways to expand the research into other projects. So to go more in depth on certain entitlements where we might not have had the time to go into certain research, or the research ended at the end of 2019. The world has changed a lot since then. So to follow up and expand the research and to see what has changed, especially, for example, with the start of Corona and the global pandemic. So as we end near the end of the project, these are the ways forward that we're looking at, both as a project team, but also as a research center in general. So we look forward to your questions. Thank you for staying with us for this long. It can be way more in depth, but hopefully this was a very, very good overview. If you have a question that you feel more comfortable, for example, emailing us about, this is our project email, entitlements@aucegypt.edu. Once again, thank you for attending this brief presentation on the project, and I look forward to answering your questions. Okay, I'm going to go through So Rahim, you have a question about education and language, I believe, and integration. So based off of our research and what we found, there's always been pressure, I want to say, or bits of a push from UNHCR and from other agencies to try and include all of the refugee communities, especially within primary education. There has been talks, for example, for offering especially Arabic language classes. This, as you mentioned, is a form of integration, which is a UNHCR durable solution, right? So UNHCR has three main durable solutions when it comes to refugees. Either the refugees are resettled, so they go to a country of resettlement. They return to their country of origin if it's safe, right? We can't force someone back to their country of origin, but if they voluntarily want to return, they can return. Also, local integration, as you have mentioned. Obviously, not being able to access education makes integration difficult. Not knowing the language makes integration difficult for everyone, not just children. So we do know that in certain neighborhoods and in certain organizations, they do offer Arabic language classes. So I think this can be helpful, especially when trying to access schools. But also we would like to see a bigger proliferation of Arabic classes available, and either at a very, very minimal cost or free of charge, especially for vulnerable populations who may not have the economic means necessary to take these classes. But you're right, I think it will help the educational process for everyone to have a more diverse student body. As I said, I think there's talks about this. There are definitely classes that are happening, but I think it needs to be broader and reach more individuals. So as we mentioned, this is one of our recommendations in the report. How do they get certificates from public schools if they get educated in their curriculum? So for example, Egypt, and I still think this is the case, recognizes the Sudanese curriculum. So many students will sit for the Sudanese exam. I know certain NGOs help pay for this. I believe St. Andrews does, perhaps CRS. So people will sit for the Sudanese curriculum, and it is recognized in Egypt. For others, what I've mentioned is that they actually do get the certificates from the Egyptian public schools. So if they're Syrian, if they're Yemeni, if they're Sudanese, if they're South Sudanese, they can register to attend the public school system. And many of them do. However, they don't necessarily attend the classes. They attend classes in the community schools. So the curriculum that they learn is perhaps Sudanese, it's Syrian, it's Yemeni, it's whatever. But then they go and they sit for the exams in the public school. And as long as they pass, then they receive the certificate from the public school. So this is then how that certificate is recognized, because it's actually from the Egyptian public school. However, as I've mentioned, the community schools are not legally recognized. So their certificates, if they give any, will not be recognized. We can send the slides to your emails after the presentation, if that will be helpful. That's not a problem at all. With BESM related to getting a job, yes, okay, employment. Getting a job and getting hired, as I've mentioned, is extremely, extremely difficult in Egypt because there are so many procedures that foreigners have to follow. They need to receive a work permit, and in Egypt, you as an individual cannot apply for a work permit by yourself. You have to have your employer apply for you. So for many employers, this is very costly. It's very expensive. As I've mentioned, it can go up to 12,000 Egyptian pounds per year. And it's very time consuming. So this is why many companies or employers right off the bat don't want to even bother hiring foreigners. And even though there are special procedures, as I've mentioned, for refugees, they're not necessarily followed. so many work in the informal sector. Also, we know that some refugees work on what is more like a volunteer contract. So they do get paid every month, and perhaps they get a stipend for health insurance at some organizations, but they're not technically legally working in the eyes of the Egyptian government because they don't have a work permit. So employment, like I said, super complex and really, really complicated. And this is why we see many individuals, especially migrants, working in the informal sector, unfortunately. Yes, we will post. We're recording this talk, so we will post it on our YouTube page and then on our social media channels. So if you don't follow us, we are the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at CMRS_AUC. So we'll post the recordings, no problem there, Miriam. Sometimes the yellow card requires, well, yes, unfortunately we know, especially during COVID, that sometimes it takes a long time to receive the yellow card, and then if you do receive a yellow card, it takes a long time to get an interview, to then go through the refugee status determination process. We are aware of this. I think many organizations are aware of this. But even so, if you have approached UNHCR, you should be under their protection as an asylum seeker by law. So even if you don't necessarily have the yellow card in your hand, you should still be able to approach them, or if you're arbitrarily detained or something else happens, you should be able to go to UNHCR for this. Is there a master's degree program? So AUC has a master's degree specifically in migration and refugee studies for those who are interested. I'm a graduate of the program, so I have to do a little shout out that it is a very good program. There are scholarships available for people, African nationals. There's another scholarship for refugees. There's the Jamil Fellowship, which is for Egyptian nationals, which is not only for migration and refugee studies, but also other master's degree programs available. There's also a master's degree, for example, in public health, if health is something you're interested in. There's one in community psychology, which I know a lot of people do, especially if they're working at PISTIC or other organizations that work with refugees and psychosocial awareness issues. So there's a community psychology one. There's also one in public policy, if you're interested in how policy is written. And there's one in global affairs as well, which is more general and more like international relations. But if this is also something you're interested in, there's also one in humanitarian law. So the great thing about refugee and migration studies is that it can fit into many different facets and programs. So if you take classes, you take them in law and psychology and sociology and anthropology and public policy. So it can come from many different areas. So I hope that helps you, Alia. Mutasem, can you? I don't know. Mutasem, can you see? I don't know if you can unmute yourself. If not, can you please write your questions in the chat box?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have one of questions about the family reunification for us. If you have one of the family members in outside, how to make family reunifications. And the other questions I have to write, I need to explain for traveling document in refugee in Egypt. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mutasem. You unfortunately picked the two hardest entitlements for questions. So family unity and reunification, as I have mentioned, doesn't unfortunately happen often in Egypt. There's no clear procedure in the law for you to apply to be reunited with your family in Egypt. So this is number one, unfortunately. Has it happened? I know like a few people but they were also students, and they were able to apply for a visa for their family members, but only like one family member was accepted and not others. So it seems to be kind of up to the whim or up to the opinion of the government official that you might come in contact with. But when it comes to the law, there's no domestic legislation which has procedures for family reunification. When it comes to travel documents, technically under the 1951 Refugee Convention, all refugees are supposed to be able to receive travel documents. So for example, let's say you're a refugee in Egypt, you're a student, you got accepted for a conference in Austria, you don't have a passport or your passport expired, you should be able to receive travel documents to travel to the conference. Now, as I mentioned, you're beholden, you have to follow the same visa procedures that an Egyptian would to travel to Austria. So you probably have to apply for a Schengen visa. It can be accepted or it can be rejected. However, in Egypt does not issue travel documents at all for refugees. So even though this is an entitlement that refugees are supposed to receive, unfortunately, Egypt does not issue travel documents at all. So it just doesn't exist in Egypt. So obviously our main recommendation for this is that, Egypt were to issue travel documents, but they don't, unfortunately. Omar, I hope that also answers your questions about travel documents. Yes, Bassam, I know. People lose their cards, they misplace them, not even UNHCR cards, but residency cards, vaccination cards, everything. We're hoping that people are at least lenient and compassionate when it comes to these issues that many people face. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, but sometimes it is. This is why there are different organizations like UNHCR and others who attempt to help. This is obviously outside of our jurisdiction. As a research center, we just try and, do the research, pass on the research to others so you're aware of your rights. But there are other organizations who are better equipped in dealing with these issues than we would be as a research center. Is it possible for a refugee who is close file to not go back and apply for residence? Actually, it is. It is possible if you are a close file refugee to apply for residency. Does it happen often? No. Obviously, most people just stay irregularly. They work in the informal labor sector and they live their day-to-day lives. However, it is possible, for example, if you were to apply to school and you got accepted, that the school could be your guarantor and you could apply for a student visa, for example. If somehow you were able to find a job as a close file refugee and you found someone who is willing to pay for your work permit, you could apply for residency through your work permit. Is it possible by law? Yes. Is it very common? No, because of the difficulty in getting a work permit or having the school try and sponsor you. But if you were to have a sponsor within Egypt and you are a close file, you can technically apply for residency, yes. But the majority can't or won't, so they remain irregular within Egypt if they don't want to return to their countries of origin. Hassan, yes, of course. I am coming. Obviously, we're a research center, right? So I, as a project manager and my colleagues, our goal is to help the communities, the practitioners, the researchers know what the law is. Is the law theoretical? Yes. Is the law always followed? No. You're talking specifically about healthcare. We know there are a host of issues when it comes to trying to access healthcare. Hygiene issues, lack of beds, low quality, et cetera, et cetera. Discrimination, we 100% know. However, at least the law is there, right? We're coming at it from saying, well, we have a good foundation. We have a good starting point. Are there problems? Yes. Are there issues? Yes. But if people are aware of the foundation, if they're aware of the starting point, if they're aware of their rights, then, right, we can probably go somewhere. We can move something. And if we can get our recommendations out, if we can get our research out to the communities, this can spark change, right? And this is our hope. We know it's theoretical. We know we're not a government institution. We're not policymakers, but this is our hope. So obviously we know that there are issues in accessing these entitlements, but our goal is for the awareness to be raised amongst the communities on what, A, the entitlements are, but B, what access you should have. And perhaps if you already know what the issues are, we can work with the issues and try and find a different way. Yumna, do non-Arabic speaking asylees and refugees have access to interpreters? So, for example, it's mainly through NGOs and advocates. We, as a research center, have a specific program, actually, that is the Cairo Community Interpreter Project. And through this project, we have trained many interpreters over the years. Many of them go on to work in organizations like UNHCR, especially during the refugee status determination interviews, but also different organizations provide interpreters. For example, if someone needs to go to a hospital or government institution. But like I said, perhaps if there's an emergency or you're arbitrarily detained, you might not have access to an interpreter. So this is where we see a lot of the issues. Or there could just be a lack of interpreters at the time you need. Maybe, we've worked with tons of interpreters from different languages, so I'm almost certain most of the languages are covered, but there might only be like 1 or 2 interpreters per language. So these are mainly the issues that we find, but we do try and train interpreters to know, especially how to work with vulnerable populations and communities. I think you made unaccompanied children. Yes, unaccompanied children have even more issues, unfortunately. There are specific, I think Caritas, for example, works specifically with unaccompanied children when it comes to accessing healthcare. But you're right, they have many issues, for example, that children who aren't unaccompanied might find, especially when it comes to accessing education. I know St. Andrews also, I believe, has an unaccompanied children project where, they do different activities with them and then they volunteer at St. Andrews. So of course, they do face more obstacles and complications than, say, a non-unaccompanied child, but there are certain organizations who are trying to work with them. But opportunities in the future, of course, difficult, not only for unaccompanied children, unfortunately, but all refugee children, sadly. 2 more questions. Volunteering opportunities, not right now, but if we do ever have any opportunities, we will post them on our social media. So if you do follow us, then hopefully you'll see them. Hassan, community members, the ID card waiting. Yes, we know. Appointment times, calling UNHCR, not getting through. We 100% know that these are issues. Again, I know we're coming at it from a very theoretical legal perspective, and we know there are issues in implementation. We know that there are problems. We also know that the organizations also know that there are problems. But sometimes, unfortunately, we just have to live with it and do the best that we can. So we are at the end of time, friends. Again, thank you all so much for attending. We hope that you learned at least something from this webinar. Again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to either message us on Facebook or send us an email. I'm putting in the chat, this is the link to the full 322-page report. This is the link to the annex to the report, which has all the laws available. So international, regional, bilateral agreements, domestic law that is perhaps would be of interest to you. And the last thing I'm going to put in the chat is the Arabic summary of the entire report for those who would find it helpful to have it available in Arabic. So once again, thank you so much for attending. We hope to see you at future events for CMRS. And yeah, thank you so much on behalf of Aya and Amina and myself. And have a good rest of your day. And like I said, Arabic webinar, Thursday, 2 p.m. Tell your friends. It's pretty much the same information, but in Arabic. So we hope to see you there. And thank you.